am here today talking with Pems, the author of Hacking Heaven, Mushrooms in the Bible. Why don't we first start talking about how you got on this journey towards this conclusion that Jesus is a mushroom?
Well, ironically, it started when I was a teenager, back listening to psychedelic rock. I was really into classic rock in high school, and one of my favorite bands was The Doors. And I didn't just like the music. I wanted to understand where all this stuff was coming from. So, I wanted to know about Jim Morrison. So I read Danny Sugarman wrote a book called No One Here Gets Out Alive. And in that book, it describes like all the things that Jim Morrison was into. The Doors got their name from Aldous Huxley, and then that went to William Blake. And he was really into the beatniks and Nietzsche, and then, of course, LSD. So that was kind of what inspired me to want to check it out. So eventually, and I read about all this before I ever did drugs. I was just fascinated by it. So eventually, one of my friends got me some LSD, and I took it this weekend. Not this weekend, but I took it back in the day, and I had an amazingly fantastic, fun time on it. There was nothing to me that was really weird in the mind. It was all very physical and out there, and just like geometric patterns and shapes and lots of giggles. It was super fun. And then the following week, during class, I had to read the book of Genesis at school. We had to read about Adam and Eve. And I had never read that. I didn't grow up with religion. So all of a sudden, I had just taken acid. I had this really weird experience. And then a couple days later, I'm reading the Bible. And I'm reading about Adam and Eve and how they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so they develop a knowledge of good and evil, which tells them that they're not wearing clothes. That's kind of the first distinction they make. So I was really fascinated back then, and I was always fascinated with psychedelic drugs. I mean, I wasn't into the Bible or any of that at all, so I never really thought much about it after that until later in life. Again, music. I was listening to Bob Marley, and Bob Marley and the Rastafarians, they do a lot of what their beliefs are drawn from the Book of Revelations, or at least when you read their songs, all seem to reflect all this Book of Revelations. So, listening to Bob Marley, I went back and I had to read the Book of Revelations. And in there, the whole book is inspired by a guy eating a little scroll and having a vision. And when I was a little kid, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so I knew what a scroll was. And if you ever look at a scroll handle, they actually kind of resemble a mushroom. It's really, that just crossed my mind as I was reading. It's like, wow, this guy ate this little scroll, and obviously they didn't have books back then, and it's been since translated as book. But again, after that, I went back and I started rereading the Bible, and I saw these incidences where angels appear near trees, and Adam and Eve.
Now, was that years later?
Yeah, this was later and this was probably in the late 90s. Again, okay. So I was right around 98 or 99. I'd always listen to Bob Marley.
You were in school at the time, or?
What's that?
Were you in school at the time?
No, I was teaching, actually. I was teaching elementary school. Mm-hmm. So going back and reading through the Bible, there's also Moses finds something under a tree and gives him this godlike knowledge. Then, and also in the story of Exodus, they eat manna, which falls out of the sky mysteriously and appears in the morning as a small round thing. So it just seemed like there were all these mushroom symbols, and I started writing them down. And then I'm also friends with a marijuana researcher, cannabis researcher by the name of Rob Connell Clark. And I was talking to Rob about it, and Rob was like, well, there was a book that came out in the 70s by this guy, John Allegro, and so the story, the idea is out there. He's all, but that book's out of print, and right now there's no one else who's talking about it. He's all, what you should do is, he's like, you should write your ideas down because they'll be original to you. He's all, then go back and go look at Allegro's work and try to incorporate, his work to support your idea. He's all, that way you'll sort of create something unique. So that's what I did. And that was back in, around 99, 2000. And so I wrote a lot of my ideas down, and by the time I went to try to publish my book, 2 books had already come out on it, and I felt like I had missed that opportunity. And I still added to this idea over the years, but more recently, since they're starting to try to decriminalize mushrooms, I thought that the opportunity was great. It's something that's really close to my heart, and I want to be involved in it. So I decided to publish my book and to try to, facilitate this idea.
Now let's go back to the book for a second. What are some compelling arguments that you have that Jesus is a mushroom?
Okay, well, the idea that Jesus is a mushroom really, it's got to be taken in context with the whole Bible. So, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, Christianity itself is really drawn from Judaism. In some ways, you could just look at it as a type of Judaism that's been perverted and changed over the years. But originally, it was drawn straight out of Judaism. And so we have to go back and look at, again, the stories of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They experience some sort of form of consciousness that, again, it's a self-consciousness. From there, you also have Moses in the burning bush. Moses discovers something under a tree that gives him also, he's basically God that he finds under a tree. And we know that Amanita mushrooms, they're red, they grow under fir trees. If you know anything about color, red and green are opposites. So, I mean, it would be very contrasting when you see them appearing, not like it was on fire, so to speak. Then later, also, Moses has manna in the desert. Again, in the middle of the night, these small round things appear on the ground, and they're able to sustain the people through their hunger. And we know that mushrooms, you can eat them as a source of nutrition. They also can poison you, and they also give you psychedelic experiences. So, I mean, that's just the past part of some of these ideas. And then when we talk about Jesus, we can start with the description of him, his name. He's called Jesus, but even Jesus Christ can be translated as truth, the Savior. There's a lot of things in there in the Bible where he's referred to as a gate, the door, the true bread, the living manna. He's called the light, the rock, an elect stone, the embodiment of Logos, the Word made flesh. So all of these taken together, it's almost as Jesus himself as some sort of passage. And the description of a rock. Mushrooms actually, when they start growing, if you've ever seen them, they can appear to look like rocks from a distance growing on the ground. So let's take the idea of him being described as manna. Manna was what they ate in the desert to survive. And Jesus also actually encourages people to eat of his body, right? And that's how you would experience the kingdom of heaven. In a lot of ways, you think of maybe Jesus as a deification of the mushroom. It's like the mushroom and the experience have been turned into a character. And it's not just a character, it's a godlike character. I think in the past mythology, you'll find that instead of a deification of the mushroom, they just personified it. And that some of these things would have just been like a man, like a mushroom described as a man who is more of a superhuman, but eventually it becomes God. So you think about this, you're eating Jesus, you pass through the door, the gate, to another type of consciousness. Now, in addition to that, we have the description of like Jesus' life story. Okay, mushrooms appear out of nowhere pretty much. When you see them, they magically appear overnight, like manna, right? Well, ancient people didn't understand spores and how mushrooms occur from mycelium under the ground. To them, it would have been a virgin birth without a seed. And they understood seeds. I mean, these were agricultural people very close to the land, so that they grasped. So if something appeared without a seed, it was seen as miraculous. Furthermore, one of the things is that the mushrooms actually, they melt in the sun, so to speak. It's called deliquescing. Also, other animals will eat them, and bugs will eat them, and eventually will disappear. And then, miraculously, when the conditions are right again, mushrooms will appear in the same area because their tree, so to speak, is underground. It's the mycelium, and what we're seeing are the fruiting bodies. So that in of itself is like the resurrection. Lastly, though, I think, and then putting this all together, I think, is the idea that Jesus speaks in parables. And one of the things is the word parable. It's interesting, too, the Bible is translated, right? But they leave some Latin words in there. And when parable is Latin, and there's a lot of different translations of it, but one of those words, one of the ways of translating parable is riddles. So then we can start to look at Jesus as a riddle, and if we think about this, take all these ideas into account and look at it like this. What do Adam and Eve eat? What did Moses find under a burning bush? What was manna? What has a virgin birth and comes back to life? What can you eat and have a life-changing experience? And on top of that, what also looks like a rock? So in these regards, again, I think of it as all putting all these ideas together. It's as though that this is all about mushrooms, and they've just they've encrypted these stories in such a way as to make them obscure so that only the people who wrote them really understand what's going on. And so part of that, again, getting back to the idea of Jesus, is all of this, I believe, has to do with a hierarchy in society where you had an elite class ruling over the slaves. And so the slaves are meant to believe the literal story of Jesus, while the ruling class actually understands the true meaning behind the symbols, and that is irony.
So you mentioned that Moses and the serpent of the garden are the same characters. Is that kind of like a similar idea? They both mushrooms in that instance?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is I have my background is in literature, and again, ironic to me, I spent most of my career studying literature before I ever read the Bible. And then when I went back and read the Bible, I realized that most Western culture is premised on the Bible. It's almost like a lot of the stories are referencing that. So if you study literary analysis, you look at characters and you look at plot lines, and if you look at it like that, you're just evaluating a story. So you think about Satan and Moses, both of them are second in command. They both stage a rebellion. Satan is kicked out of heaven, and Moses is sort of kicked out of Egypt. And we think about, Satan is cast out from heaven, Moses ends up wandering in the wilderness. And in a lot of ways, there's really not a lot of descriptions of the devil or Satan in the Bible. They're very vague, and they're just a couple sentences of description. But then if you thought about maybe Moses is a fleshed out version of what Satan was, a lot of people aren't really familiar with the Bible. They don't read it themselves. They just go to church and they're told what parts to look at, and I don't blame them. It's boring in a lot of ways, and it's symbolic and you don't really know what you're looking at, so it's not that interesting. But when you really look at some of Moses, some of the things he does, he kills all kinds of babies. He kills his own people when they go out into the desert. Anyone who opposes him, they annihilate. They create this circumcision process where they're cutting the tip of the penis off of their males, which is, the most sensitive part of your body. That's a really strange satanic thing, if you ask me, to do to mutilate our genitalia.
Right.
But all of these things is like it's rebellion. What they both come to represent is this rebellion. And I think Jesus in the same way is also that sort of rebellion, but it's a spiritual rebellion from when we talk about Jesus, as opposed to a physical rebellion when we talk about Moses. And yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you what did John Allegro bring to this?
Well, John Allegro was a fascinating guy in that he was assigned or tasked, it was part of his job to interpret some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. And Allegro my understanding is, I've spoken with his daughter, and what I understand is that he didn't have any ambitions to discover mushrooms. It was coincidence. It was like me, except John Allegro is 100 times smarter than I am when it comes to linguistics and foreign languages. So instead of just seeing the obvious patterns that I saw, he was recognizing that some of these words were phrases that if you translated the phrases into Sumerian, you actually came up with the name of a mushroom. So he was finding a code embedded within it. And again, he was taken off the case. He wasn't allowed to finish his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the middle of all that, there was I think it was the 7 Days War or whatever it was, where they basically, Israel, I think all these were kept in Syria. I can't remember all the details off the top of my head, but they ended up getting the scrolls. And so I think it's only been recently that they've started to retranslate the Dead Sea Scrolls again. So Allegro's role in this was he was one of the first people to really, I think, create a very articulate explanation into the actual language of the Bible and its connection to ancient languages, and explain some of the linguistic structures. At the same time, it's very technical. And so what I'm interested is trying to just focusing on how language, again, operates a hierarchy so that this ironic scheme works in a master and servant situation. And so...
Right. Interesting. Well, okay, so how does this work how can this be incorporated into somebody's conventional Christian beliefs? Can it? I mean, what are the implications? for an ordinary Christian that about the Bible and the Bible being about mushrooms?
Well, I think that I think all religions at some point, they started secret societies, and the goal is to promise freedom to people who are living in an oppressed society. But invariably, these religions become rackets, and they actually are using the religion to suppress the people who practice them. So I think a lot of Christians actually use Christianity to suppress themselves, not for the betterment of themselves, but to be better citizens in a way, or better employees. And again, and a lot of that is compromising ourselves. So I think the transubstantiation, when you talk about eating the body of Christ, is like all you need to do to make Christianity real is to eat mushrooms and continue to practice. I think a lot of it would manifest and make itself be understood through that process. Because right now it's like I don't think you have to eat mushrooms, but I think if you're aware of this idea, it will make it so that you're not just faking it. Again, to me, otherwise, it's like if you believe Jesus was a superhuman spiritual entity that physically existed and walked on water and was a real thing that people interacted with, I think you're totally misleading yourself. And then it sets you up also for other misconceptions about the world, because once you're willing to believe fantastic mythological stories are real, then they can convince you to fucking believe anything. And therein lies the problem, is that why is this symbolic book taken seriously, and how do they pick and choose? But if you can point out that these are all symbolic and metaphorical and meant to be taken another way, I think Christianity is an awesome spiritual advancement tool. But again, I think a lot of people are not using it that way. And they're using it. It's being used in such a way as like blinders that you put on a horse, and it's used to control people. You remember a long time ago there was a Twilight episode, what was that show, The Twilight Zone?
Right.
There's an episode in there. It was called To Serve Mankind. It had aliens coming down, and they had this book, and it said to serve mankind, and they were trying to say they were going to be here to help us, but it was really a cookbook. I mean, that in of itself right there makes all the sense in the world. Is that book really for us to serve God, or for us to serve, the elite system, the Babylon system that the Rastafarians talk about?
They talk about where mushrooms are not just in the Bible, but everywhere. You mentioned in your book that the Egyptian ankh, Thor's hammer, Plato's Socrates, works of William Blake, Holy Grail, Philosopher's Stone, King Arthur's sword in the stone, Mexico's flag, Santa Claus, the Buddha, are all possible mushroom symbols. Let's just talk about Socrates. You think Socrates was a mushroom?
Well, I think that Socrates, he falls in that same sort of paradigm. It's like the same plot line, the same model as Jesus. I think Jesus might actually be modeled after Socrates, because a lot of the early Christian texts were written in Greek, and a lot of the people who were followers of Plato would be familiar with that. And I think it's a very Greek idea. So when you think about, Socrates in a lot of ways is, he corrupts the youth, and he does it through language. That's the thing about Plato, and that it's dialogue. It's just talking. So this character is able to come along and change the way that people perceive reality. And that's not a good thing for society, because society, in the way that we operate, is premised on this fake reality, this simulated reality that we talk about. And so I think, again, we're talking about characters that are sacrificial. And so I think that's what they share in common. And so again, there's a lot of examples of these symbols. It's like, let's just say that every culture encountered a mushroom, and in their own way came up with a way to mythologicalize the mushroom. So it's different everywhere, but it's the same. You'll find a lot of the rebirth, the resurrection, the becoming godlike, experiencing visions. These are all very similar.